You are listening to a podcast created by the Minnesota Alliance for Geographic Education. Our mission is to help you understand your world better through geography. This is part 2 on the start and growth of Minneapolis and St. Paul, Minnesota, called the Twin Cities. This podcast will explore reasons why some cities grow in size far beyond other cities. Part 1 illustrated why the Twin Cities got started at this particular location. Several Minnesota geography standards are addressed in this podcast, including 63361, 93364, and 93491. Our presenter is Dr. David Lanegren, Professor of Geography at Macalester College in St. Paul and Director of the Minnesota Alliance for Geographic Education. I am Fred Kunze, a member of the Minnesota Alliance for Geographic Education. And now, here's Dr. Lanegren.
Now that we've had an overview of the points that serve to localize urbanization, the Fort, Mendota, the city of St. Paul, city of St. Anthony, and Minneapolis, let's take a little closer look at exactly what was going on. So as we heard, the land was cleared of Indian title east of the Mississippi first, so St. Paul was developed at the point where Trout Valley enters the valley of the Mississippi River. Now, this was not the head of navigation. You could take steamboats further upstream. In fact, steamboats could go all the way out to Granite Falls, and they could go up to the falls at St. Anthony. But if you look at this little map, you see the steep banks of what we call the Mississippi Gorge that begins at Fort Snelling and runs up to the falls of St. Anthony. So this valley was cut by a huge waterfall at the end of the last ice age. And when the Europeans got here, the river had eroded back to where we now see the falls of St. Anthony. Another tributary falls of that was the falls, the Minnehaha Falls, and of course Granite Falls out in western Minnesota. So St. Paul was settled not because it was the head of navigation, but because it was where you could get from the river to the upland pretty easily. Now, this image that you see now called the Port of St. Paul gives you a sense of the hustle and bustle at that port. You'll notice there weren't elaborate docks. The steamboats carried their docks right along with them. And you'll notice, if you look carefully, there's a little short railroad that's being developed there and some warehouses, grain elevators. This is the embryo for the development of the major port at the city docks there, and of course eventually the connection by railroad. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The big force behind the early development of the port at St. Paul was the Red River ox cart, a very efficient form of transportation for hauling buffalo hides and buffalo bones from the hunting grounds up by the Canadian border and then brought overland by these ox carts to the port of St. Paul. You may wonder why oxen were used rather than horses. The answer is pretty simple. Cattle can eat just about anything and thrive on it, so these cattle could walk across the prairie eating grass and not lose weight. Horses could not do that, so this very efficient system of ox carts was developed. But of course, eventually the buffalo were killed off and another product had to be developed, and that would be timber and agriculture. Now, this next image shows the city of St. Paul in 1874. You can see there's a bridge across the river. There's some boats sailing up and down. The steamboat era has come. The city is prospering as the state capital, the center of financial trade, and the beginnings of the railroad. But very, very little industrial development. The industrial development was happening over at the Falls of St. Anthony, a source of power, vast amounts of power available at the falls, and the settlers at the time knew exactly how to use the falls to provide energy for their manufacturing. The other interesting thing we've talked about before, so we see here in these pictures the falls. Now, these are various artistic renditions of the falls, but you get a sense of the appreciation the Europeans had for the power potential here. The Native Americans valued the falls for different reasons. They were not, of course, using the waterfall technology to mill grain. To them, it was a more sacred place. Above the falls, there was no gorge, and that's where these bridges could be built. And as we heard in the earlier session, this was the first point where the Mississippi was easily bridged because of island in the middle called Nicollet. So the one bridge went over from the east bank to Nicollet Island, and the second bridge from the island over to the west bank. And that became the crossing point, so wagons could go across the river easily here, heading west to open up the agricultural areas. But then, I guess even more importantly, the railroads could come across and open up the new hinterland. So this map that shows the Twin Cities in the third epoch of urbanization, the railroad era, shows two lines, one dotted line which shows the end of agriculture in about the Civil War period in 1880, and then the other dark line shows it in 1920. So in this 40 or 50-year period, the big boom in agriculture in the Red River Valley and western Minnesota occurred, and that produced a vast amount of products to be shipped out of the region to markets in the east and abroad. So we see in this picture the railroad port of St. Paul, pretty much on the same site as the steamboat port, but now dominated by the new form of overland transportation, the very efficient steam rail system, which expanded out over the prairies. There was an intermediate economic development in Minneapolis around timber industry, but that was soon replaced by the grain industry. St. Paul emerged, again, as I said, not as an industrial area, but as a sales point, and you can see here the warehouse district in St. Paul, people serving hardware and providing a various range of commodities to the farmers out in the hinterland. As you can see in this old illustration here, the Falls of St. Anthony lined on each side by mills and industrial buildings, and it became the milling center of the world, really. If you look at this next old postcard that shows the West Bank, and it indicates it's the largest milling district in the world, and actually each side of the river was in competition with the other, and they would take turns setting the record for the amount of grain milled each day. So Minneapolis developed this tremendous industrial base based on agricultural products. You can see in this next one an artist's view of the area, a little better view in the sense that it gives you an idea of how prosperous the place was and how happy people were to be there. So large numbers of jobs created, and the agricultural hinterland provided a base for a whole range of industrial activities, not just grain milling, but producing bread and products that were used on the railroad, such as blankets. And the investors that built the wheat-based agricultural milling economy here continue to stay in the Twin Cities and invest in other industries, and they shifted out of this primary production into secondary activities, farm machinery, and eventually things like radios and advertising, and finally, of course, sports.
You have been listening to a production of the Minnesota Alliance for Geographic Education. Background music is courtesy of Jim Hogue of Decorah, Iowa. The Minnesota Alliance is a nonprofit group of educators and other parties who are interested in promoting an enhanced understanding of our world through improved geographic literacy.